The news. What is it? Where do we get it? And who gives it to us? What's in the daily news? I'll tell you what's in the daily news. Story about a guy who bought his wife a small ruby with what otherwise would have been his union dues. That's what's in the daily news. The news is something we get every day, one way or another. It's the weather, stock market, sports scores, gossip, politics, and, yes, facts and opinions. It's the news that shapes opinions and influences what we think and how we vote. So what we get and where we get it is important to our ability to make choices. The reporter who writes the story greatly influences the final impression we take away. Not that reporting the news has ever been a straightforward, impartial rendition of factual information. 100 years ago, we got our news from newspapers. Some papers were more accurate than others, and that hasn't changed. When I was growing up in the 30s in New York, there were lots of choices. In the morning, there were the Times and the Herald Tribune. And for those who never cared to learn how to properly fold a real newspaper, there were the two tabloids, the Daily News and the New York Mirror. In the afternoon, we had the Sun, World Telegram, and New York Post. As always, you could choose to read newspapers that tell it the way you like to hear it. In the 1920s, radio entered the home. The news came directly into the living room in the form of a live human voice. We were hearing the news in real time through the magic of wireless. No voice was more respected than that of Lowell Thomas. Every evening he covered the political, financial, and cultural events from the perspective of a person who had visited every country, spoke dozens of languages, and knew more sheikhs and rajas than any man on earth. As a reporter in the Middle East, he met T.E. Lawrence, an English archaeologist and officer in the British Army. Thomas enhanced his own reputation by publicizing Lawrence, who provided him with exotic accounts of Middle East intrigues. Both men had a flair for showmanship. Lowell Thomas didn't pick up this outfit in the African bush. Abercrombie and Fitch on Fifth Avenue would be more like it. But where did Lawrence get his get-up? Or could that actually be Peter O'Toole, outfitted by MGM's wardrobe department? Lowell Thomas's daily 15-minute broadcast included a very brief mention of the Sun Oil Company. In those days, programs had just one sponsor. I still identify Lowell Thomas with Blue Sunoco, Jack Benny with JELLO, Bob Hope with Pepsodent, and the Lone Ranger with Silver Cup Bread. If you liked the broadcast, the cost was free, so you returned the favor by buying the product. When Thomas's broadcast was cut from 15 minutes to 5, he decided that radio was deteriorating to crass commercialism and left the show. Fortunately, his final broadcast was recorded. Here it is, Thomas's last radio broadcast.
The career of veteran newscaster Lowell Thomas goes back to the very first days of radio. He was a pioneering announcer on pioneering station KDKA in Pittsburgh, and even reported on the flight of Charles Lindbergh. He then had a distinguished career at NBC, finally moving over to CBS, and that is where many of us first heard Lowell Thomas. But along the way he wrote books, an enormous book about Lawrence of Arabia, traveled the world, did documentaries. He narrated newsreels that millions watched every week in theaters, narrated adventure shows for television, and continued to do his Monday through Friday 15-minute newscast on CBS. Finally, CBS shortened his time from 15 minutes a night to 5 minutes, and 2 of those minutes were devoted to commercials. So here is Lowell Thomas's final 5-minute newscast, as heard at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the night of Friday, May 14th, 1976.
Here comes today's news. Good evening, everybody. This is Lowell Thomas. There's hardly time to do what I'd like to do at this moment. As you may have heard, I'll be off radio for a while, but There's nothing in the rumor that I'm retiring. Nothing. On the contrary, I'll probably be busier and more involved than ever. But tonight, I do want to thank all of my associates. And I want to go way back to the beginning, 46 years ago, and pay a special tribute to Bill Paley and also to General Sarnoff. They were the first to put me on the air with what has been the longest-running broadcast of any sort, not just news. Seems odd that at one time I had all the air of the entire world to myself alone to tell about the day-by-day adventures of the human race. Human interest, adventure, colorful stories from around the globe have been my specialty, and the present radio format allows only enough time for headlines. To the members of my staff and to my colleagues with whom I have worked here at CBS and for many years at NBC and the other networks too, ABC before it was ABC, it's impossible to tell them how grateful I am. And the same to all of you who have been listening. I'll be off on a brief vacation, perhaps doing some glacier skiing in the mountains of British Columbia and Alaska. Instead of my usual so long until tomorrow, or until Monday, since this is Friday, tonight it will simply be, here's to all of you. So long.
Gabriel Heater will forever be identified with, "There's good news tonight," the expression he used when finding some tiny bit of optimism in the darkest days of the Depression. In 1932, the nation was obsessed with the kidnapping and murder of the Lindbergh baby. Bruna Hauptmann was tried and convicted for the crime and sentenced to death by electrocution. The night of the scheduled execution, the entire country anxiously awaited the final word, but there was a delay. Gabriel Heater ran through his notes after 15 minutes and had to ad-lib for another full hour. It was the news story of the century, but in the end it was Heater that had the last word, and he would forever be associated with that broadcast. The Zeppelin Hindenburg was the largest airship in the world, in fact about the largest of anything in the world. To appreciate the size of this behemoth, you have to compare it to a modern airliner and the largest ocean liner of its day. Just imagine how much hydrogen it took to keep it aloft. It had made over 50 safe transatlantic crossings until... Here is the voice of Herbert Morrison. His agonized sobbing at the microphone conveyed the tragedy to listeners well beyond the effect of the printed word. Emotion had impact.
It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Get it started. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh my, get out of the way, please. It's bursting into flames and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's like 400 or 500 feet into the sky. It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around here. I told you, I can't talk to people. There's friends around there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there, massive smoking wreckage. And everybody can't hardly breathe and talk and screaming. Lady, I'm sorry. Honestly, I can hardly breathe. I'm going to step inside while I cannot see it. Charlie, that's terrible. Listen, folks, I'm going to have to stop for a minute because...
Years later, a movie film of the tragedy would be added to the voice recording and shown on television, but that original radio broadcast was the beginning of radio news. Movies were the television of the 30s. In addition to the featured films, we got news in the theaters in the form of newsreels. Going to the movies was inexpensive, and it was not uncommon to go to the neighborhood theater once a week.
centre of our year of festival was London's South Bank exhibition. The King was welcomed by Mr. Attlee and Mr. Churchill as Premier and Leader of the Opposition. Before the year was out, they were to reverse roles. Among the 8 million visitors was the Queen Mother. In all, 250,000 people came to Britain from overseas to see the exhibition.
A typical movie program on a Saturday afternoon would consist of 2 movies, 1 newsreel, 1 cartoon, coming attractions, and another episode of a serial. The view we received of the world, the Middle East, China, the American West, politicians and bankers, soldiers and criminals, world leaders, and the underworld were all colored by the images on the movie screen. Bogart and Charlie Chan left indelible impressions as we left the movie theater bleary-eyed after 4 hours of assorted films and short subjects. Then came Pearl Harbor.
And representatives, I have the distinguished honor of presenting the President of the United States.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The heroism of our fighting men, but avoided depicting the worst horrors of the fighting. But Bill Malden captured the essence of the infantry with his cartoons that appeared in Yank magazine. Willie and Joe were the real G.I. Joes that every American family worried about. Ernie Pyle stayed with the troops, sharing their danger and misery. He died in Okinawa, having continuously placed himself under fire with the troops. The entire country grieved for him. H.V. Kaltenborn was one of the first announcers to make regularly scheduled radio talks on current affairs. Commentary was added to reporting. The war ended and H.V. Kaltenborn made it official.
Good evening, everybody. And tonight I feel like talking like Gertrude Stein. The war is over. The war is over. The war is over. Peace has come, peace has come, peace has come. Yes, you can say it with emphasis, for it's ringing in millions of hearts all over the world tonight. That glad, glad news that we've been waiting for years. And here it is. Sometimes it hardly seems for a moment that it can be true. We've become so immersed in war. We have lived the war so completely, so intensely, that this transition from one moment to the next into peace seems almost impossible to realize. And yet, we know it's true. We know that the President of the United States has told us that it was true. And here is what he said. The words deserve repeating again and again. I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Harry Truman imitated Kaltenborn's cultivated diction when, in 1948, Kaltenborn prematurely announced the election of Tom Dewey as president. Dewey lost the election, of course, and Kaltenborn became the butt of 1,000 jokes. Edward R. Murrow would have been justly remembered for his broadcasts from London during the Blitz. However, he achieved even greater respect after the war. Murrow had the guts to stand up to Joe McCarthy at a time when few people, including President Eisenhower, would risk the political fallout of an argument with the senator from Wisconsin.
The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. No one familiar with the history of his country can deny that congressional committees are useful. It is necessary to investigate before legislating. But the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and the external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who feared to write, to speak, to associate, and to defend causes that were for the moment unpopular. This is no time for men who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent, or for those who approve. We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the result. There is no way for a citizen of a republic to abdicate his responsibilities. As a nation, we have come into our full inheritance at a tender age. We proclaim ourselves, as indeed we are, the defenders of freedom wherever it continues to exist in the world. But we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves.
William F. Buckley was the eloquent voice of conservatism. Anyone who could extemporaneously speak for 3 full minutes, keeping perfect syntax before coming to a period, deserves some special respect. It always puzzled me that anyone so educated and articulate, with a sense of humor to boot, could be the leading voice of the right. Good night, Chet. Good night, David. It was an innovative idea that added new texture to news programs. Having 2 anchors permitted a variety of styles. Chet Huntley, a Westerner from Montana with a commanding voice and straightforward presentation of events, contrasted with David Brinkley, sitting in Washington, D.C., wryly commenting on capital stratagems. The introduction of 2 anchors opened the way for female newscasters. Barbara Walters, longtime host of the Today Show, developed a warm, casual way of probing guests in contrast to her male colleagues. Walters became the first female co-anchor of a network evening news program. This was the first crack in the glass ceiling of the anchor's sound booth. How many times have we watched that clip? The most respected journalist of our times announcing the assassination of a beloved president.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Those few minutes of stories, it seemed fitting that we heard it from Walter. 30 years ago, the evening news programs were dominated by Tom Brokaw, John Chancellor, and Dan Rather. Perhaps Brokaw was more personable, Chancellor maybe more serious, and Dan Rather more friendly. No matter, they each presented the news in a straightforward, non-partisan manner as befitted their common Midwestern upbringing. Of course, the newspapers were still around. The Times said Ford castigated New York. The News put it differently. But more people were getting the news from television. Tim Russert. What kind of a man would bring guests to a news show, then on camera confront them with their own misstatements, and then be thanked for it? Answer, a man with a twinkle in his eye. He would challenge his guests with their own words, determined to expose duplicity without excessive embarrassment. Tim Russert's good nature, combined with sharp-shooting questions, made NBC's Meet the Press the most popular of the Sunday morning news programs. The evening news programs on the 3 television networks were a half-hour long, not really enough time to give in-depth coverage of major events. But CBS introduced an hour-long news programs on Sunday night, 60 Minutes, which typically covered only 3 stories, allotting 20 minutes to each. 60 Minutes specialized in investigative journalism, particularly when adversarial interviewer Mike Wallace was the reporter. Sometimes reporters would go undercover and pretend to be prospective clients of some shady operator and catch said operator attempting to swindle the client on camera. It made for gripping and revealing television. Created by Don Hewitt in 1968, 60 Minutes is still going strong, although with a different lineup of reporters, and now including some soft news stories. Originally, television broadcasts were received over the air, and a set could only receive 12 channels, 2 through 13. When cable TV became available, the number of channels exploded. Cable channels carved out niches for themselves: food, sports, music, and, naturally, news. CNN was the first cable news channel broadcasting news 24 hours a day. A steady diet of news repeating the same stories over and over might not seem the most attractive, but with the seemingly endless supply of experts to comment on the stories, cable news became attractive to advertisers. CNN was relatively neutral in its political coverage, but soon enough, Fox came along with its right-wing slant, even though its slogan was fair and balanced. To counteract Fox News, MSNBC adopted a mostly left-wing bias, although its morning host, Morning Joe, added a more conservative point of view. Both Fox News and MSNBC, however, appear to be preaching to their respective choirs. But there is an alternative. PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, provides intelligent programming for adults as well as children, for discourse without polemics, for reporting on science and art and politics in a nonpartisan way. The viewership of PBS has been steadily increasing. PBS's primetime ratings for news and public affairs programming is 108% higher than CNN's primetime audience. Sesame Street, Masterpiece Theater, Nova, among others, have been outstanding, but public TV still attracts just a fraction of the viewers of cable. While network TV was fighting with cable over market share, there was an elephant in the room. The internet has changed everything. We got Wikipedia and Google and Facebook and Twitter and a million other things we never asked for, didn't really need, and can't live without. Jeff Bezos undercut every bookseller in the country. Before he was finished, he not only destroyed Barnes & Noble and Borders, but Amazon devastated every shopping mall in America. We got our news from iPhones, smartphones, iPads, tablets, and even watches. And we got it anywhere at any time. Then came the social media. You didn't have to waste time selecting news items of interest. Your friends did it for you. 100 times more people get their news from Twitter than from the New York Times. But it depends on what you call news.
The public are the newsmen. They are the reporters because they have their iPhone, their iCam, their iPad or their cell phone, which has a motion picture camera in it. And they can send a feed to Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or whatever. And as you see, the news programs say, send your video feed to such and such an email address. And it's the latest thing in group sourcing the video and the on-the-scene reporting.
Another story about a particular subject, and you can go to maybe reference 10, 15, 20 different news stories on the same thing, which is...
Is that good?
Yeah.
Maybe it's overkill.
It's the intellect of the person as to where he feels, or whether they're more on the left or more on the right or in the middle, where they would choose to go. And it's an education. Make a decision based on all the news that you collected from all this as to what you really believe and what you think is actual factual, what is factual.
Are there too many ways of getting? Is it more confusing now?
No, not to one who wants to find the truth.
Where do you get your news from?
It changed. I used to watch a lot of Fox, and I used to go from Fox to NBC because I would get a dichotomy of the two there. And then I started watching PBS a lot. I like PBS a lot.
Now ask yourself, where do you get the news today? I'll tell you where you get the news. Most people get it from the internet. In fact, about half of the young people in this country get all of their news from the internet or television. That's it. They don't read newspapers. That's it. Onion. Does anybody know what Onion is? That's supposedly the most important site for news that exists. Hard to believe. Go Google it. See what you find. What else? Pick a subject and you can find the news. There's a million channels. In fact, they've got news for sports, news, as we know, for cooking, news for this, news for that. There's even news on the stock market, believe it or not. Sometimes there's news about the news, what's going on domestically, what's going on overseas. But what's so interesting is that print, while it serves a purpose, is no longer the main vehicle. Radio is no longer the main vehicle. Even television, for many people, is not. Cable is being surpassed. So we blot our heads full of a cacophony of sound, and that's what we have to deal with.
200 years ago, we got our news from word of mouth. 100 years ago, we got it from newspapers. Then radio brought news directly into the home, instantly. In the 50s, TV entered our homes. We got Milton Berle and free access to 9 channels. Now we get our news from gadgets that are on our wrist, in our pockets, in our ears. We get the news at home, in cars, while walking, working, eating, or talking. We don't have to look for news, it envelops us, wherever we are, whether we want it or not. News is more available, more accessible, and more diversified than ever before. The question then is, are we better informed? We choose what we read, see, and hear, but we tend to choose sources that we trust. That is, sources that speak to our own prejudices. But we do have choices, good choices, and that's what counts. If we aren't well informed, the fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves. Thank you.
I'll be off on a brief vacation, perhaps doing some glacier skiing in the mountains of British Columbia and Alaska. Instead of my usual so long until tomorrow, or until Monday, since this is Friday, tonight it will simply be, here's to all of you. So long.